One of the greatest obstacles to crafting health and wellness is identifying and controlling inflammation. It's at the core of all complex and chronic diseases, and it's the driving mechanism that underlies the most common symptoms that people like you struggle to overcome. Join us as we explore cutting-edge science and research to give you the information and tools you need to create the quality of life you want and deserve. And now, here is the host of Inflammation Nation, Dr. Stephen Noseworthy.
Hey there, and welcome back to the Inflammation Nation podcast. I'm Dr. Steve Noseworthy, and we're continuing on with our mini-series on obstacles to weight loss. And today is probably going to be a little bit longer than most of my episodes that I've been putting out. I've had a rash of new clients in my one-on-one consulting practice and have been busy getting people started on their personalized functional medicine programs. And so here we are. We've got a longer episode today. So since it's been about a week since I put an episode out, let me just quickly review what we've talked about so far. I think we first started talking about calories in and calories out, and how things like simple concepts like calorie deficits only work, pardon me, when all things are equal, all other things are normal, meaning that there are no other obstacles, metabolic or otherwise, to weight loss. Spent some time in one episode talking about my own struggles with weight loss, where it seems I woke up one day and I had gone from 195 pounds of very lean and athletic to over 240 pounds out of shape and a pre-diabetic, worried that I was going to die of a heart attack at the age of 38. Then we moved on. We talked about the hypothalamic set point, where it's very easy for your body to gain weight and then reset what it considers to be normal at that higher weight, and how it's very difficult to lose weight because your hypothalamus resists change in the form of weight and specifically fat loss, because it fears it is in or will be in starvation mode. And so it hangs on to that higher weight and more body fat for dear life, saving it for a rainy day, so to speak. And then we talked about setting clear goals. And clear goals means to focus on the long game and not the short game, and that rapid and extreme weight loss is almost never permanent, and that permanent fat loss is about slow change over time to allow your hypothalamus to accept change without much resistance. And at some level, of course, it does become about calories in and calories out, because in general, you're not going to lose weight or body fat without a caloric deficit. But most people who struggle with fat loss, when they're in a caloric deficit, do have metabolic obstacles other than simply a higher hypothalamic set point. So in terms of goals, in general, you want to shoot to lose about 10% of your body weight at a time. And you aim to lose no more than 1% of your body weight per week until you reach your 10% goal, which means on average about 10 weeks at a time. And then after that 10-week period, losing 10% of your body weight, you take a break for at least half of the amount of weeks that it took to get to that 10% weight loss. And you continue in the cycle of losing weight and then taking a diet break until ultimately you lose, say, 5 to 8 pounds more than your ultimate goal, so that when you finish your last, let's call it diet cycle, and you go to eating maintenance calories for your new body, you can take an extra few pounds on again that will come on and you'll still be at your goal weight. So we actually overshoot the goal and then settle back into something that you're happy with. So today, I want to start talking about the 5, let's keep it to 5, most common metabolic obstacles in weight loss. And there's more, but the top 5 probably account for most of the challenges that people will experience, at least in my opinion. And so we'll stick to the top 5. And here's a short list. They are high fasting and postprandial insulin, hypothyroidism, probably no surprise there, an increased inflammatory load, dysbiotic overgrowth in the gut and changes to your microbiota, and finally toxins that act as drivers of inflammation, hormone disruptors, but perhaps more importantly, obesogens. So let's talk about insulin and blood sugar first. And I imagine as we go through this, we'll probably have one episode on each of these 5 different obstacles. So insulin and fat loss. Like in general, we have 2 broad blood sugar phenotypes. And insulin is all about blood sugar control. And so in these two broad phenotypes, and by phenotype, I mean a way that your genes are interacting with your diet, your lifestyle, your environment. And those two broad categories would be those who are predisposed to low blood sugar, or what we might call functional or reactive hypoglycemia, and those who are predisposed to high blood sugar and are on the path towards metabolic syndrome or prediabetes and perhaps type 2 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes is a different animal because it's autoimmune related. So in general, and we're going to break it down between the high and the low blood sugar tendencies. In general, people with low blood sugar tendencies tend to have lower insulin, and that's usually not an obstacle to weight loss. So they tend to have lower insulin and higher insulin sensitivity. And we'll define that here in a second. But this means that for people who tend towards that phenotype, how their genes are expressing, this means that insulin is probably not a major antagonist to fat loss unless their insulin is spiking periodically through the day as they eat junk food, sugar, processed carbohydrates in an effort to keep their blood sugar levels up and stable. In other words, it's possible for someone to have a normal fasting insulin when you test it, say, first thing in the morning, but to have frequent enough glucose and insulin spikes throughout the day that the intermittently high insulin increases fat formation and decreases fat burning. And I'll talk about how you can recognize patterns like this in yourself in a moment. So that's the low blood sugar picture, if you will. In general, those who are predisposed to high blood sugar tend to have high fasting blood sugar and at times high blood sugar randomly throughout the day, unless they have a reasonable degree of insulin sensitivity that allows a higher insulin to keep control of their blood sugar, making it theoretically normal up until the point where they can't do that anymore. So let's define insulin sensitivity and insulin resistance. First of all, insulin is a hormone that's produced by your pancreas in response to a glucose load or a blood sugar load. And that's going to come predominantly from consuming carbohydrates of different kinds. Different carbohydrates elicit different responses from insulin. For example, a salad that is full of non-starchy vegetables or carbohydrates with fiber in it is going to elicit a smaller insulin response than, say, eating a cup of rice or eating a bowl of pasta or eating French fries. These will elicit a larger insulin response. Therefore, the types of carbohydrates you choose to eat and how much of them you choose to eat radically affects how high your insulin goes and how long it stays elevated. The higher insulin goes, the longer it stays elevated on average, or the more frequently you have these intermittent spikes in insulin, the more likely insulin is going to be an obstacle to fat loss. And this is a problem because physiologically, insulin causes increased fat formation and it decreases your ability to break down body fat to use it as a fuel source. And so the net of having chronically high insulin is increased body fat and resistance to fat loss. And that's why it is perhaps the number one priority when we start talking about possible metabolic obstacles to weight loss. Now, back to this concept of insulin sensitivity and insulin resistance. So when you eat carbs, more carbs, you get more insulin. And how much insulin you get is going to be determined by a couple of things. First and foremost, whether or not you are eating insulin-promoting carbohydrates like sugars, grains, starchy vegetables, too much fruit. And secondly, how much of those things you're eating. Listen, if you eat one French fry, that is not going to spike your insulin, even though we say eating French fries or potatoes is probably going to promote a higher insulin. You eat one French fry, you're not going to get a massive insulin spike. But if you go to, I don't know, Five Guys, and you order their large fries and you eat it all by yourself, then watch out. You're getting a huge carb load followed by a massive insulin surge because you ate way too much of an insulin-promoting type carbohydrate, something that has starch in it. And finally, Independent of the type and the quantity of the carbs you eat, your insulin response to carbs is going to be dependent on how sensitive your cells are to the action of insulin. So it's not just the types of carbs you eat, how much of the carbs you eat, it's whether or not your cells can respond to the action of insulin. And so all other things being equal, it takes more insulin to do the same job when your cells are insulin resistant, and less insulin to do the same job when you are insulin sensitive. And so within reasonable boundaries, it is highly favorable to be more insulin sensitive than to be less insulin sensitive. We'll talk about an exception coming up here. And so the action of insulin is really quite simple. Insulin binds to receptors on the surface of your cells, causing these little doorways to open up on the surface of your cells. And these doorways allow glucose, or your blood sugar, to move from your bloodstream into your cells, where they can use glucose as a primary fuel source, fueling function, giving you energy. And for sake of argument, and I'm making these numbers up to illustrate my point, let's say that you are 100% insulin sensitive and you have no resistance. So you're 100% insulin sensitive and you have no resistance, which would be normal. When you eat carbohydrates and your cells respond to an appropriate amount of insulin, let's imagine that with 100% sensitivity, let's imagine that that means that 100 little doorways open on the surface of your cell, and you clear out all the glucose that you need in that moment. So 100% sensitivity is normal, and in our made-up example, that means that when you eat carbohydrates and insulin goes up and binds to the receptor on your cells, 100 doorways open up on the cell, allowing glucose to go in where it burns energy or creates energy as a result. But let's say that something has changed. And let's say that your cells are not as sensitive as they used to be. Let's say that they're only 75% as sensitive as before, when they used to be 100% sensitive. And this means that you have lost insulin sensitivity, or sensitivity to insulin, or another way to say it is, you have become more insulin resistant, because this is very important. Sensitivity and resistance are opposites of each other. The more sensitive you are, the less resistant you are, or the less resistance you have. The more resistant you become to the action of insulin, the more sensitivity you have lost. And so they're inversely related. More sensitivity means less resistance, and vice versa. And so in our made-up scenario, where now you are 75% sensitive instead of 100% sensitive, instead of clearing 100% of the glucose from your bloodstream because you opened 100 doorways, and again, these are made-up numbers to illustrate a point, let's say at 75% sensitivity, you only open 75 doors, clear 75% of what the normal capacity is, and that leaves 25% of the glucose that would have been transferred from the bloodstream into your cells, stays in circulation, and recirculates unused by your body. And this is a problem for a couple of reasons. Number one is that the longer this extra glucose floats in your bloodstream, the more opportunity it is, or it has, to become oxidized or damaged by things that promote oxidative stress or inflammation. And this oxidized glucose molecule interacts with your tissues and causes damage. If you look at blood testing, for example, this is typically how we interpret hemoglobin A1C, or the HbA1c test, is as a surrogate or a marker to estimate how much damage is happening in your body as a result of excess glucose in your bloodstream. Now, this is why people who have high blood sugar problems, like people with insulin resistance, pre-diabetics, metabolic syndrome, or full-blown type 2 diabetic, this is why they get peripheral neuropathies, like numbness and tingling in their hands and their feet. This is why they get ulcers that don't heal, or they get microvascular disease. They lose their kidneys, they lose their retinas and their vision. They get heart disease at higher rates. It's because the high blood sugar causes damage to cells. And so it is advantageous to us to have normal blood sugar control, normal insulin production, normal insulin sensitivity, so that when we eat, we get rid of that blood glucose fairly quickly. We use it for fuel, and we don't allow it to circulate around, wreaking havoc on our physiology. And so again, being insulin sensitive is a good thing as long as it doesn't go too far. More on that in a second. Being insulin resistant or losing sensitivity is a bad deal in the sense that it causes or promotes metabolic and physical damage to your cells and to your tissue, promoting diseases and problems we don't want. But the other reason that insulin resistance is bad is because the pancreas senses that it didn't do its full job. In our scenario where you're 75% sensitive when you used to be 100%, and after all, in that scenario, you only clear 75% of your glucose load because only 75 doors opened instead of 100, and you cleared less than you were supposed to clear. What ends up with the pancreas, because of the innate intelligence and the intelligent design of the human body, the pancreas actually makes more insulin, adding more insulin to the insulin it had just produced to try to overcome the resistance from those other 25 doors that didn't open the first time. So the amount of insulin that used to open 100 doors now opens only 75, and the only option the pancreas has is to make more insulin to get those extra 25 doors to open so it can handle all the glucose. It essentially tries to kick down the door, if you will, into the cell that didn't respond with that first load of insulin that came out. And since this secondary insulin response, or this extra insulin production, gets added to the first one, when you're insulin resistant, it requires more insulin than normal to clear 100% of the blood sugar that should have been cleared. And this is the key point. One of the main features that drives insulin resistance is chronically high insulin. And so it becomes a self-perpetuating problem. As you eat more carbohydrates that your body can't process properly, you make more insulin, which makes your cells less responsive. And if you keep eating the starchy carbohydrates that are insulin promoting, you end up having to make more insulin to do the same job. And that more insulin causes more loss of sensitivity and more insulin resistance. And that's a downward spiral that just tends to get worse and worse over time. And as I said earlier, it's a metabolic obstacle to fat loss, and it's a promoter of fat accumulation. This is why controlling insulin is so important, and it's so important to know if your insulin is under control and if it's not. So it is possible to keep your blood sugar in the normal range, yet because you have an underlying insulin resistance, it requires more insulin that's climbing higher and higher over time to maintain that normal blood sugar. This is a nuance that a lot of clinicians, and I just don't think they're aware of it. Not that they don't understand it, because it's a simple concept once you understand that it's a problem. But what ends up happening is that these increasingly higher levels of insulin that's required to overcome some degree of resistance, is that eventually a given level of insulin stops working. Because again, higher insulin means more resistant. And so what used to work doesn't, and you need even more insulin to do the same job. And so what we tend to see on labs, for example, is there are several different common scenarios, if you will. The easiest one is high fasting blood sugar above the lab range or above our functional range, and high fasting insulin. That's the easy one to pick. But what happens if you have a high normal blood sugar and you don't look at how much insulin it takes to create that? That's where a lot of things are being missed, and I think where a lot of people are being unintentionally misguided. No one's trying to trick you, but sometimes people simply just don't look. They don't look deep enough or look at enough things. And so here's how this plays out in real life. I was working with a lady client not long ago who was doing quite well with diet and exercise and had lost about 30 pounds on her own. And then the weight loss stopped. And it turned out that towards the end of losing the initial 30 pounds, she had changed her exercise routine and her diet. She started lifting heavier weights and doing more sets in the gym, more work. And, thinking that heavier weights and more work requires more carbohydrates to fuel that type of activity, she added more carbohydrates to her diet than she had been eating before. A lot more, in fact, almost double the amount of carbohydrates. Now, she wasn't exceeding her daily energy requirements with the more carbohydrates because she increased her activity, which meant she needed more fuel. The question was, what was the impact of adding more carbs to her diet or certain types of carbs? And did that have an impact on her blood sugar control, but more importantly, on her circulating insulin levels? Now, what happened? Not only did her weight loss stall, she actually gained 4 pounds or so. And now that could have been extra muscle from lifting heavier weights and doing more work. And that by itself would certainly not necessarily be a bad thing. But when we did her labs to see if we could spot any metabolic obstacles to weight loss, what we found was that she did indeed have a normal fasting blood sugar that was at the upper limit of what we consider to be normal. And, sorry, you got ambient noise out there. And what we found, in addition to her high normal fasting glucose, was that she had a laboratory high fasting insulin level. And so what was happening was that because she had added more carbs to her diet, she triggered an increased insulin response to handle that extra carb and that extra glucose load. And even though she had enough insulin sensitivity that the extra insulin allowed her to keep her blood sugar in the upper limit of what we consider to be normal, it took way too much insulin to create that. And the extra insulin not only shut down her fat burning potential, it actually encouraged her body to regain some of the fat that she had already lost when she had more control over the carbohydrate content of her diet and a normal or a more normal fasting insulin level. And so what we did was we dialed back her volume and intensity in the gym. We reduced her carbs to the types and the amounts that she was eating before. And after a few weeks, as her insulin levels started to come down, she started losing body fat again. So what's the bottom line? If you are struggling to lose weight and nobody has helped you check your fasting glucose and insulin levels, and they have to be done at the same time, then you need to get that done. You need the visibility on that part of your physiology. Fasting glucose by itself, which pretty much every doctor is going to run, especially when it's normal, really tells us very little about a system that is much more complex and much more dynamic, which you can't understand just by looking at a fasting glucose. Like I said, you can have a normal fasting glucose, but if it takes a boatload of insulin to make that reality happen, then you don't know that you have an underlying insulin resistance problem that is promoting fat accumulation and inhibiting your fat loss capacity. And to be honest, when you look at the paired data set of fasting glucose and fasting insulin, it's a powerful and insightful way to see if you have a problem and what degree of insulin resistance you have or what degree of sensitivity you have lost. And the cool thing is that we have a mathematical formula that we can plug those numbers into a calculator, if you will, and we can actually get a numerical value. And we can know, are you at 100% sensitivity, or are you at 75, or are you at 53%, which is a value that I just saw with a client this week. So let me go back to something that I was saying before about people with low blood sugar, and how some tend to have, and let me just say it again so you don't miss it, low blood sugar, people with low this functional reactive hypoglycemia, and how some people with low blood sugar tend to have intermittent spikes in insulin that can add up over time to create a similar situation that I just described for people with high blood sugar. And it's really not about the blood sugar itself. It's about whether or not they're having intermittent spikes in insulin that is intermittently and accumulatively, I don't even know if that's a word, but we'll use it anyways, it's accumulating its impact over time. So now we just talked about decreased insulin sensitivity and at least two of the many problems that it can create, because there are more issues with having decreased insulin sensitivity or insulin resistance. Some people who are on the low blood sugar side actually have an increased insulin sensitivity where, say, instead of clearing 100% of their glucose load, they actually operate at upwards of 150 to 200% sensitivity. In other words, they have magnified or increased the efficiency with which they clear glucose. And now listen, in a trained athlete, this is an advantage. For someone who is, heavily muscled, if you will, who is very well trained, especially in high performance sports that demand things like strength, power, and speed. But for the average person who's not an athlete doing that kind of training, what it allows for, by having increased insulin sensitivity, or what we call insulin hypersensitivity, is that it allows for the body to clear too much glucose from the bloodstream too rapidly after they eat, and it leaves them in a deficit, as if their blood sugar had dropped below a certain threshold, meaning basically that their blood sugar drops or tanks an hour or two after they eat. And this is what we call reactive hypoglycemia or functional reactive hypoglycemia. And these are the people who have to eat like every couple of hours, or else their blood sugar drops and they get hangry, they get irritable, they get cranky, they get jittery, they might get tired, they might get a migraine or some other type of headache until they eat something. And if these episodes of low blood sugar are severe, or if they happen frequently, people usually reach for junk food and sugary, processed, refined carbohydrates to stabilize their blood sugar, because they're trying desperately to get function back and to resolve their symptoms. And a lot of times people have developed this pattern where they actually use a loss of function rather than hunger to let them know, hey, it's time to go eat something. Because ideally what should happen is you wake up in the morning, you've got some hunger, you eat your breakfast, you're not hungry anymore. It doesn't have to be breakfast, any meal. Like, you get hungry as your blood sugar goes down, your brain senses a drop in fuel, and it sends a signal that says, hey, go eat something. So you go eat, you satisfy your brain's need for fuel and energy. Sorry, ambient noise again. You satisfy your brain's need for energy and fuel, and then you're no longer hungry because you don't need more fuel. You've got it until you use all that up. What's deleterious and disadvantageous is for someone to not understand that when they have these blood sugar and insulin type issues, quite often hunger signaling and satiety signaling gets messed up. And so you're hungry when you shouldn't be, when you have no true physiological need for food, or you're not hungry when you should be. And then, if you don't know that you need food until you lose function in some way, every time those episodes happen, it promotes a vicious cycle where you're more locked into using, say, carbohydrates as a fuel source, but damage is done. By the time you go through this cycle of losing function and then stabilizing by eating typically carbohydrates, the damage has been done, and this, starts getting kind of hardwired into your system. And it tends to promote things like anxiety, insomnia, in some cases, forms of OCD, believe it or not. These things are all linked together. So what happens with people who have this low blood sugar, high insulin or hyperinsulin sensitivity? When they eat, their blood sugar comes back up, their symptoms disappear, they feel better for the moment, only to crash at some future point when their increased insulin sensitivity clears their glucose too rapidly and too much again, and then off we are into our vicious circle and vicious cycle. And the pattern just keeps repeating and repeating. So how do you recognize these tendencies in yourself, whether it's the high blood sugar stuff or the low blood sugar stuff? Now, I've gone through some of these things in prior episodes, but let me just kind of give you a recap. Number one, ask yourself this question. When you eat, do you feel better or do you feel worse? Because remember, the only thing that should change is you got hungry, you ate, and then you're no longer hungry. If you have a change in function or symptoms associated with eating or not eating, then you have a problem within the realm and the domain of blood sugar control, which may or may not involve things like insulin sensitivity, insulin resistance, or insulin hypersensitivity. So the question is, do I feel better or do I feel worse? If you eat and feel better, meaning something that was not working works better, then you trend towards reactive hypoglycemia and perhaps insulin hypersensitivity. If you're the person who has to eat every hour and a half or every 2 hours to keep your brain working, your energy working, to stave off anxious events or nervous, jittery feelings or headaches, then you probably got insulin hypersensitivity. If you eat and you feel worse, now that could be a couple of things. For example, It could be you ate a food that you're sensitive to. It could be that you ate a fermentable food that is feeding an infection in your small intestine. But those things aside, talking strictly about blood sugar control, if you eat and you feel worse because of blood sugar spiking, especially if it's carbohydrates or sugar, then you are trending towards high blood sugar, high insulin, insulin resistance, metabolic syndrome, and it's the pathway to type 2 diabetes. So again, ask the question, do I feel better or feel worse when I eat? What should happen is I get hungry, I eat, and I'm no longer hungry. And throughout that entire period of time, my function has not changed. The only thing that showed up was hunger, and then the hunger has gone away. Another question you can ask yourself is how long you can go without food before something goes wrong. We all should have the ability to fast for days on end. Obviously within reason, right? I'm not talking about extended fast of, 5, 10, 14, 40 days. I'm talking about fasting overnight, maybe for 16 hours, or if you decide to do a weekly fast for 24 hours or even 2 days consecutively. You should be able to fast and maintain function because your body should be metabolically flexible and adaptable to say, okay, you're not eating or you're not feeding me. So I'm going to go to my second line of defense, my backup plan, if you will, to create my own energy. And this is where a lot of the benefits of things like intermittent fasting kick in without getting down that bunny trail. So if the answer is you can't go more than 3 or 4 hours without eating something or else something goes wrong, right? You get some kind of a symptom. Then you trend towards low blood sugar and perhaps insulin hypersensitivity. I would suggest to you that the shorter the window is that you can go without food, the more insulin hypersensitivity you have. And it's important to make sure you're eating enough calories throughout the day and eating with a frequency where you avoid and you prevent those episodes from happening. And again, I would argue in that scenario that if you can only go let's say 1 to 4 hours without having to eat to suppress symptoms, that you have lost some degree of metabolic flexibility and you're less able to use both dietary as well as body fat as fuel for function. And that's not necessarily a good thing to be locked into let's call it a glucose dominant energy metabolism system. Now, on the flip side, if you can fast for 16 hours or more and feel great, then your insulin sensitivity is probably under control. Plus, you probably have the metabolic flexibility or the capacity to switch from carbohydrate energy sources into fuel into fat as your primary fuel source. And so ultimately, at the end of the day, if part of your goal is to lose weight by losing body fat, you need to develop the metabolic flexibility to burn fat efficiently as a fuel source. You might be able to break down body fat and get it out of your cells into your bloodstream, but if you can't efficiently burn it as a fuel source, it will just get repackaged back into your fat cells as fat. That's just the way it works. A lot of this, again, is tied up into your blood sugar pattern and whether or not you need or you have some degree of either insulin resistance or insulin hypersensitivity. All right, let's clue this up and just talk a little bit about some labs that you can get that will help give you some insights into this. We've already talked about most of these. Number one is you need to look at fasting glucose and fasting insulin, both drawn at the same time. And you want to fast for 12 to 14 hours. Like, don't fast for 8 hours. Have your last meal, say, at 8 o'clock at night and get your labs done, say 10 o'clock in the morning. That gives you a good 12-hour fast, but 14 might be more appropriate. So fasting glucose and fasting insulin. You want to have, number one, let's say a fasting glucose in the middle of the normal range. Let's call it 85. Like we can argue all day long about what the optimal glucose is, but remember, this is one part of a more complex and dynamic system. And someone telling me their fasting glucose is 85 tells me nothing unless I know other things, like what's their function like? Are they an athlete? How do they train? What do they eat? It also doesn't tell me anything until I know how much insulin it took to create that 85. If somebody has a fasting glucose of 85, for example, and they have a single-digit insulin and they're an athlete, I'm perfectly happy with that. But if somebody has a fasting glucose of 85 and their fasting insulin is above the lab range, say at 25 or 30, I don't like that at all because it took way too much insulin to create that normal glucose. So you have to look at both numbers together in the context of person's symptoms as well as their lifestyle to really truly understand what's happening with their blood sugar handling. So fasting glucose, fasting insulin. Next thing is the hemoglobin A1C. We talked about that as a marker for oxidative damage to hemoglobin that's caused by glucose. Now, in reality, that's not the only thing that can cause the hemoglobin A1C to go up. But for the purpose of this conversation today, let's just assume that if your hemoglobin A1C is above, say, 5.5, 5.6, that you probably have a hyperglycemia issue, high blood sugar, probably high insulin, certainly an inflammatory load. There are some exceptions to that, but let's just kind of keep it simple for today. And then there's another marker that we usually use to take a look at blood sugar metabolism. And it's an enzyme called LDH, or lactate dehydrogenase. This can tell us about glycolysis, which is glucose utilization, but it can also tell us a little bit about systemic inflammation if that is an issue. So fasting glucose and insulin, hemoglobin A1C, plus the LDH enzyme. So that's it for today. That's metabolic obstacle to weight loss number 1, accounted for in the books. Next time we meet, we'll talk about your thyroid and your basal metabolic rate right here on the Inflammation Nation podcast. Thank you so much for listening to the Inflammation Nation. If you found this episode valuable, please rate, review, and subscribe to our podcast. Be the first to know when a new episode drops so that you can stay on top of your game. It also helps others like you find the answers they need. And why not head over to my main website, drnoseworthy.com, that's drnoseworthy.com, to explore my personalized functional medicine coaching programs, submit a question to the podcast, maybe take a quiz, or even reach out to me using the contact form that you can find there. We'll see you next time.